Welcome to Real Life Fiction Stories, and thank you for joining me. What a night, huh? Light bouncing shadows around. You can almost see the face of a man carved from stone determined to finish the course. Reminds me of a story. The story I'm told is true. It happened to a friend of a friend and began on a night not unlike this one not so long ago, and well, it just so happens to have been in this area not too far away. A story about a man in the Old West, whose most feared weapons are his words. A man who finds himself driven to murder, and runs away only to find running can never quite take you far enough. And sometimes, freedom means blood, and truth, it means death. The moon had just begun to rise over the wind-swept granite hills studded with deer grass, sage, and the sparsely scattered foothill pine. 2 horses marched steadily against a descending path heading east, their riders silent as the large animal's footfalls cut into the dirt and gravel with a heavy crunch. The night breeze had been constant, and the air crisp against the men's faces, causing the bounty hunter to secure his coat tighter and bend his head to the oncoming current of cool air. The bounty stared into the gentle wind as though it did not exist. The capture 2 days prior had been long and exhausting for both, and the road back no place for respite. But only the hunter showed it. The man the hunter had pursued had begun the fight, giving all one might expect one to give when fighting for their life, but in the end, it was different. The hunter had managed to corner his prey with nearly a full revolver while the bounty only had 1 shot left. For a moment, the hunter believed he might take his own life rather than go out fighting. Instead, he dropped the gun and surrendered. The hunter wondered if it was the days in the wilderness with no food or water that had weakened his resolve. Nevertheless, it seemed an odd thing to do given the charges the man was facing. He had been witnessed in the murder of the local town's justice of the peace entire family, his wife, his 17-year-old daughter, and 21-year-old son. From the moment of capture until now, the bounty refused to speak. He had simply raised his hands and allowed himself to be bound and carried away. The hunter had stopped trying to get him to talk after the first day. There was no point in the end. The only time the hunter addressed his bounty was to announce a rest stop or bathroom break. The hunter turned back to check on the bounty in tow. The moonlight cast shadows on the man's face like the granite walls of the canyon, deep and black. He was stolidly perched as he had been at the beginning, glaring into the distance as though he had the endurance of the mountains themselves. The hunter wasn't too sure how that endurance would fare against the hangman's noose, but it was definitely going to be something to see. The moon was now just overhead, and the air still and quiet when the 2 beasts with their packload of weary human flesh cleaving to their backs finally crossed onto the property of Clarence Davis, Justice of the Peace to Serenity Pass Township. Firelight illuminated the front window of the modest wooden home, and a shadow watched them approach only briefly before disappearing into the dark depths of the house. A moment later, the large front door facing the riders flew open. A tall and slender man with all the menace of an angry skeleton lurched forward out of the dark, lantern in hand held high above his gaunt yet determined face. He stepped toward the men in quick, almost comically large strides, seeming to glide over the porch and across the lawn, and was suddenly glaring up at the face of his family's killer. With a swift motion the bounty had no time to predict. The Honorable Justice Clarence had pulled the bounty's foot free from the stirrup and flipped him sideways off of his horse. The bounty landed hard on his stomach with his bound hands breaking his fall. He gave no cry of pain, though the thud and crack, muffled but distinct in the still air, had made the hunter wince. The justice gave the bounty no time to contemplate just how much of what was injured before he began trying to drag him across the yard by his bound hands. The hunter had just lit a cigarette and watched, still sat upon his horse, as the older man struggled and cursed, frail and bitter, barely able to move the man who easily outweighed him by 50 pounds. After managing to drag him the length of his horse, he released the bounty, pacing around him before kicking him in the side. Clarence looked down and spit on the bounty, and after a moment of staring down at him, wept bitterly. Clarence regained his composure, running his hands through his hair, and looked at the hunter just as he was pitching the butt of his smoke. "Begging your sincerest pardon, sir. Would you kindly assist me in securing this?" He broke off, visibly choking back tears of rage. "Villain," he began again, emphasizing the word, "to that hitch post in my yard while I interrogate him in your presence." The hunter obliged. Finally dismounting his horse, the hunter walked slowly over to the bounty before picking him up and walking him over to the horse hitch and sitting him down. He untied the bounty's hands and pulled them behind his back with a support post between them. The hunter saw he had in fact broken his left hand in the fall, and the justice's pulling on it had mangled it something worse. He secured the left hand but was mindful of the injuries. To the casual onlooker it looked almost compassionate. If you asked the hunter, however, he would give you a more simple answer. He would say he just couldn't stomach touching something so mangled and swollen that was still alive, and had nothing to do with kindness. It was just gross. Clarence paced back and forth in front of the bound man as the hunter gathered and hitched their 2 horses just behind the bounty. "There are 8 townspeople who saw you gun down my family in cold blood," he began coolly, emanating his years of experience as an authority of law. "They had no weapons of their own, and from all accounts have been trying to ensure you were without the very weapons that killed them. Sir, now I ask you," suddenly raising his voice and dropping to one knee to look his bounty in the eyes. He paused for a moment, letting the sounds of the nighttime insects wash over them both. "Why did you kill my family?" he asked in an almost whisper, in a poor attempt to control his emotions, as he was visibly shaking. The hunter had fallen back to the shadows of the porch, rolling another cigarette, watching intently. He really had no interest vested in the conversation, and his attention to it would have made little sense to those who knew him. The hunter hadn't been in town for more than a few hours before coming across this job by chance, and by now, he normally would have interrupted and asked for the money and left this insular collection of sun-dried hovels in the dust. But this was different. This was interesting. Would the bounty finally speak? Why did he kill the justice's family? Hell, why run away, fight like a mad cat, and suddenly drop all resolve and allow yourself to be hauled away right back? Guilt? Well, maybe. But guilty men held themselves like wet laundry on a clothesline. He had been different the whole time. He sure as hell never looked remorseful, or proud for that matter. He looked determined. For what? The hunter's face was suddenly aglow like a jack-o'-lantern in the dark of the porch as he lit a match to his cigarette and drew in, eyes never moving from the 2 men in the yard. Even from this distance, the hunter could see the contumacious glare in the bounty's eyes as he stared back at Clarence. And for the first time in the presence of the hunter, he opened his mouth, and he began to speak. The sun had baked every drop of moisture from the skin and clothes of the bounty, or whom at the time was only known as Isaiah Bennett, and his throat ached for the cool touch of water. His water had run out some miles back, and water was about as common to come by as a perfumed debutante in this godforsaken part of the country. A rarity indeed. Whether by hellish providence or divine buffoonery, he had found himself on the modest and humble streets of Serenity Pass. He had no intention of mingling with the townsfolk or staying longer than it took to find a well or place to fill his canteens. He had traveled too long in these parts to know that outsiders had no business lingering where they had no friend or kin. He was lucky. His town was small, probably a gold boom gone bust, and as such was not exactly crowded. It also just so happened to have had its own spring-fed well just off the main road before the pass into the canyon. Isaiah filled the bucket to the brim before tipping it over his head, shocking life back into him. He filled the bucket again, this time bringing it to his lips and drawing in deeply. When he was satisfied, he set about to filling his canteens. "Hello, friend," a young man's voice came suddenly from behind him. Isaiah looked up as he was laying the bucket down. "Hello," Isaiah said amiably enough, but keeping his head and eyes down as he attempted to walk by the young man. "You left this," the young man's voice again from behind him. Isaiah turned to see the young man picking up his pack to hand it to him, when a small folded pamphlet fell out of the untied top. "What's this?" the young man asked no one in particular as he stooped down to pick it up. "Oh my, sir, what pray tell are you doing in town with this filth?" the young man asked Isaiah directly this time, waving the pamphlet in the air. In a blur of motion, Isaiah had snatched the pamphlet back and had begun folding it and placing it in his breast pocket. He was cursing himself in his thoughts. How could he have left his bag? "You don't like what it says, friend, that's fine. I'll take it and my hide out of your town." Isaiah had turned around again, heading for his horse, when a small but surprisingly strong hand landed on his shoulder. "I'm gonna need that pamphlet and any of its brothers and sisters that might be hiding in that bag of yours. I need to make sure no one falls victim to its untruths. If you want to believe those lies, sir, that's fine, but I'll make damn sure no one else in this town or anyone they know follows down its path. What you have here has the potential for causing civil unrest and even riotous outbursts and mass confusion, hell, downright hysteria." The young man was clearly flustered. "I'm afraid it's my property to share with whom I choose. If you'll excuse me, I'll be moving along." Isaiah once again headed towards his horse. A small crowd had gathered, no more than 10, but which surely must have been almost half the town at that. The young man grabbed Isaiah by the arm and had spun him around, attempting to grab into Isaiah's vest for the pamphlet. Isaiah was able to knock his hand away, but instead of giving up, the young man reached for Isaiah's knife on his hip and clumsily managed to pull it from its sheath, escalating tensions dramatically. Isaiah managed to grab the young man's arms and hold them down secure at waist level before slamming his forehead into the face of the young man as hard as he thought his brain could stand. The young man was blinded by a flash of white, and his hands twitched and his knees buckled as the knife fell from his fingers. Isaiah stumbled backwards, dazed from the headbutt. There was a shriek as the two women rushed him. The younger of the two had picked up Isaiah's knife the young man had dropped. Suddenly, he was on the ground again. The younger woman had gotten to him first. As they tumbled back and forth on the ground, she slashed and stabbed at his face, hands, arms, anything of his she could reach. He shifted his weight and rolled to one side violently and suddenly, forcing her to slide off of him, stomach to back, and with one hard shot backhanded her in the face. The older woman was on him before he could catch his breath, and her hands around his throat. There was a brief struggle beneath her as she strangled him, then a deafening crack and the sound of thunder on the canyon walls. Isaiah had managed to pull his revolver from his holster and shoot the old woman in her side through both lungs. There was a gurgling rush of air from her mouth as she slid off of him, collapsing in a heap to his side. He heard the young man and young woman both stir and get up as he lay on the ground, still catching his breath. He turned to see the young woman, who had already realized her rage again, had his knife raised above her head, ready to plunge it into his heart. Another crack in that thunder, and the clang of knife on dirt as his blade fell from her grip. The young man took a moment longer to realize what had happened than she did. But once he had, he rushed toward Isaiah, now standing. "I'll kill you," he had started to say as he ran towards Isaiah, but 3 steps into his stride and that loud crack and thunder again stopped him mid-gallop and sent him on an awkward backward spin before landing face down on the road. Those left watching scattered either to get the authorities or hide under their beds. Exhausted, battered, and bleeding from God knows wherever that harpy of a child had managed to get him with his own knife, he gathered up his items, got on his horse, and headed out of town. His wounds, scratches really would heal soon enough, but he knew damn sure that the law of that town would be after him like dark after sunset. The hunter's most recent smoke smoldered at his feet as he watched the two as they stared silently at each other after the bounty had finished his story. "Do you still have it?" Clarence finally asked calmly. "Right where I'd put it," the bounty responded. Clarence reached into the bounty's breast pocket and pulled out the pamphlet. He read the cover and smiled, opened it, and laughed. He folded it up and put it back in the bounty's pocket. "I have spent the last 30 years of my life guiding this small settlement from a group of cattle farmers, miners, and settlers into a respectable town. When the gold dried up and most left, I stayed to make damn sure law and order didn't leave as well. The people alone couldn't do it. Religion couldn't do it. I did it. Part of that meant enacting laws to ensure a man's thoughts were correct, preventing the law from being violated in the first place. I've heard of your cult before. You think words have no power and you use them at will, distorting truths and misguiding the ill-informed. Oh yes, we've seen others like yourself who claim to speak in freedom. But words carry ideas, and those ideas can fester in a man's thoughts, driving him to do things he never would have on his own. Too many times at the cost of others, not just themselves. People may think they know what's right or wrong, but without their brother's loving hand to dole out consequence and reward, they're lost. Men are men, Mr. Davis, and should be free to be so. Some will do evil things, and some will do good things. Sometimes innocent will suffer and the unworthy prosper, but time and truth sort them. Those two are bigger than men, Mr. Davis. Time and truth. And you can't improve upon them. You can't shortcut them. And you sure as hell can't use them to your advantage without paying back equal measure. You're wrong to think we believe words have no power. We believe they're the strongest power a man is born with, the ability to question, discuss, and discern for themselves. You want to take away the ability to speak and self-reliance for the greater good. Folks like you seem to think that if evil men never share evil ideas, they'll never spread, but that leaves them to fester and breed below the surface. Evil ideas should be shared because exposure to truth defeats evil. Instead, all must come to you for truth and protection, Mr. Davis. I will not do that. Your day of reckoning has come, son, Clarence spoke to the bound man. Without blinking, Clarence reached into his coat pocket, pulling his revolver, and fired 3 times into the distance with the gun held as close to the bounty's head as possible. There's your trial. I let the town know if they heard 3 shots from my property not to intervene. Judgment has been passed in their eyes and mine, and you are guilty, sir, hereby sentenced to death to be carried out quickly and mercifully. The bounty heard nothing except a high-pitched whine from the gunfire. That, and death, and mercifully. No torture? He managed with a wry grin. I'm not like you, sir. You are an abomination to humanity, and I will never stoop to the low morality you've seemed to embrace. Your death will be more merciful than you deserve, if only as a testament to my compassion. The justice finished, now wearing a grin of his own. He had leaned in so close, the hunter thought the two might kiss. The bounty pulled his left hand as hard as he could at the less than fully tight loop the hunter had tied around it. The swelling had been more than he bargained for and was a harder start than he planned before he finally got it free. Clarence's eyes dropped from the face of the bounty, trying to see what he was doing behind his back. Seizing the moment, the bounty used his head once again as a bludgeon, slamming into the still smiling face of the justice. The bounty managed to fight back stars and grab the gun from Clarence's wavering grip. That familiar flash and thunder, one shot into Clarence's gut, leaving him moaning in the dirt. The hunter had started to run towards the men, but had stalled, not believing the bounty had gotten the drop so suddenly. The rolling click of the gun's hammer being cocked snapped him back to reality. The bounty got up and began to disarm his captor, tossing his weapons far into the nearby brush. So what's in the pamphlets you're carrying? The hunter asked. Freedom of thought and self-reliance, the bounty replied, taking the one from his pocket and offering it to the hunter. The hunter cautiously lowered his hand and accepted the well-creased paper. There was a sudden flash and its faithful friend a deep crack of thunder, and the hunter's eyes widened in sudden pain and surprise, raising his face to the sky in a silent scream of pain before crumbling to the ground. You let him spit on me and said nothing. Let them know the danger in following me, the bounty said, loosing the hunter's horse and sending it off into the wild before untying and mounting the remaining horse. The bounty clicked his mouth and squeezed his legs, sending his mount into a trot before picking up the pace into a full gallop. With only a dust cloud in their place, the hunter had dragged himself over to the nearby post and lay back, tying his handkerchief around the bullet hole in his knee. He rolled a cigarette and lit it, watching their dust cloud cut across the horizon and disappear into the rising sun, while listening to Mr. Davis moan himself into unconsciousness. He unfolded the pamphlet and read the cover, colloquially verbatim, and under that in fancy scrawl, though tempted to hide away the evils of man and silence the voices of those that commit them, let them be heard that they might be laughed away. Let them be written that we may ponder their folly. Let them see light that they may be scorched.